Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the office. This tonight is going to be a couple of videos broken down into sort of a series of smaller, shorter videos than I usually do. And the reason for that is because I'm going to be talking to you about several different things. Right now in this video, I'm going to talk to you about your test, which is coming up. Now, I don't want to put your test up this week because I know that it's the spring holiday and some of you celebrate the spring holiday, and I don't want you having to worry about an exam over that holiday. So it won't start until Monday of next week. I'll have it up and ready for you, and you'll have a week to take it, and it will be short answer and multiple choice only as the last one was. Yes, it's going to be a little bit behind, but you should be fine because that test is going to cover from our last test, which I believe went up to about Augustine, and it's going to cover until just before Burke. So I'm going to run that down for you right now. You've had some videos on this already, so please check those out if you haven't and make sure that you've done the readings. But essentially, here's what your exam is going to cover. We're going to sort of start right after Augustine. So we're going to go into Christine de Pizan, who you might remember is the very famous woman who wrote about etiquette, it seems like, in the Treasury of the City of Ladies and the City of Ladies. And she wrote these books addressing the princesses of the court and the courtiers to help them understand how to maneuver through sort of the royal court. We then have Erasmus, who talks about copia, where I'm not sure if I had you read this or not. I don't think that you did. I think that we decided to skip that one. So let's just go to Peter Ramus. Peter Ramus was really important because he made all of those arguments against all of our favorite philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, and especially Quintilian. He said that Aristotle didn't know how to make an argument and that Quintilian had way too broad of a definition of rhetoric, just way too broad. Because if you'll recall, Quintilian's definition is a good person speaking well. And Ramus said, wait a minute, you're taking this way beyond the definition and the scope of what rhetoric is supposed to be. It's something that you do. It's not who you are. In fact, Ramus says, look, we were given two gifts by our creator, speech and reason. And speech is style and delivery, how we present. And that's the realm of rhetoric. Reason and science are for invention, arrangement, and memoria. So this is something that, really caused us a great deal of trouble. Ramus created a world in which the canons were split, in which rhetoric was for being pretty and flowery and not for reason, which was not the way that we had been studying rhetoric up until that time. As you know, Ramus was run out on rails. However, his arguments did not immediately go away. So where, in ancient Greece, we had philosophy versus rhetoric, and in ancient Rome, we had power and rhetoric. And during the medieval period, we had rhetoric and the church. Well, we come here and we get an introduction to a third problem. The relationship between rhetoric and reason, yes, or science, or the truth, however you want to word that, and rhetoric and the aesthetic. So we have sort of this triangle of rhetoric, the aesthetic, and science or reason. And those are in contention with each other because of Ramus. Thanks. Now, keep in mind that Ramus wrote, I believe, in the 16th century or 1500s roughly. So he really caused us trouble for a long time because, in case you haven't noticed, we're still having this debate today. People still say that rhetoric is just for lying, that it's frivolous, that it's flowery, empty language that means nothing. They'll say that's just rhetoric, meaning that it doesn't say anything beyond its flowery presentation. It's art. It's aesthetic. It's beautiful to listen to. That's it. So from that point on, we have all these theorists who take one track or the other, pretty much. So let's talk about those for a quick second, just so I'm doing a good review for you for your exam. Let's start off, let's just go in order. Francis Bacon, as you'll know, he's the one, as you probably remember, he's the one who introduced us to faculty psychology. He's the one who introduced us to the four idols. He's the one who introduced us to inductive reasoning as a Baconian method of research and of understanding how we find truth. So Bacon did not believe that, he believed that rhetoric was a faculty that we had, that it wasn't necessarily a way that we get to truth. For him, the only way to get to truth was empirically, which again is through our five senses, things that we can hear, smell, taste, feel, and, wow, I forgot the fifth one. That's really bad, which in C, I think that I missed C. So if we can't use our five human senses in order to know something or learn something or describe something, then there's no way for us to find the truth other than that. So he really went on the side of rhetoric is not for reasoning, but rhetoric impacts reasoning, because when we share our scientific findings, there's an implication in that. There's a confusion in that. And the reason there's a confusion is because we're limited by the cave, by the theater, by the marketplace, by the tribe. We're limited by all of those things in what we can do. And therefore, we can only see so much, we can only feel so much, we can only touch so much, etc. And we can only use so many words to define things. So our concept of understanding in the Novum Organum, the new instrument for understanding, only pretty much demonstrates how weak human understanding can be. And so he gives us a way of looking at, look, we need to get rid of these filters. We need to get rid of these distractions. We need to put these idols aside if we're going to find the truth through empirical research. Okay. We move on from Francis Bacon to Margaret Fell. And Margaret Fell, of course, wrote about women speaking. And she was talking about specifically in the church. And she uses the Bible as her evidence. And so that is unique for a number of reasons, including that her appeal is not to empiricism and not to experience, it's to God, to the Bible. And that is probably the most interesting part of that, really. And Locke comes along, and, Fell sort of is addressing a very specific context. And I don't think I don't want to start a debate about what we can and cannot do, but empiricism implies that as a human, I have felt, heard, smelled, tasted, seen what I am talking about. And I can do that with the Bible. I can see that. I can't do that necessarily with God. So what Fell was referring to was an abstract idea more than a concrete idea, which is why her use of the Bible is so interesting there. So then we come along with Locke, and Locke's saying, okay, you guys are right. We're very confused. So let me clarify for you. Human understanding occurs because we can communicate human understanding. However, there are so many flaws in our communication, in our language, that we have a real problem. So we need to fix it. So he identifies that there's an internal understanding and there's an external understanding. So there's the intended meaning and there's the received meaning, the interpreted meaning, right, by the receiver. And those are two very different things. And so he says there's four problems with language in that give and take of communication. And I'm going to make sure that I try to remember what all four of these are. It's a challenge every year and every lecture. I forget from one lecture to the next sometimes. Words cannot represent the incredibly complex things that we think that they represent. There are words that have multiple meanings. there are multiple words for one meaning. And then the fourth one, which is the one I always forget, is that there's no relationship, no natural relationship between an object and the word that we use to describe it. So he identifies those 4 problems with rhetoric, or with language. And what does he say we should do to fix it? Well, he says what we need to do to fix it is to purify language. How do we purify language? Well, we come up with one meaning for one word, and we have that 1-to-1 ratio. And we purify language by making the meaning for those words exactly one meaning. This is clearly this would be a very difficult thing to do, because language changes over time. It changes in context. So we would constantly be trying to redefine things. And we already do that, but we sort of have a way of doing that. So we all have an agreed upon definition for the most part. And those we find in the dictionary. These are agreed upon definitions. That's what a dictionary is. It doesn't mean that if a word's in there, it is a word. It may not be agreeable to everybody that is a word. Bling was by far my worst enemy, my least favorite word. But when I was a kid, that's when we started bad, oh, that's bad, which meant good. So we really screwed things up in my generation as well as generations that followed. So words change meaning. I'm not really sure how we would purify language, but of course, John Locke felt we could do it, because a lot of these philosophers at the time felt that we could do it. They felt they were in the right. They had the answer, which we know is not necessarily true. Okay, after we leave Locke, we get into Vico, and we know that Vico is a direct answer to Bacon. Vico says, Bacon, you're wrong. We can't find truth empirically and say that's the be all and end all. Your measurements and your the human eye, they have all those limitations, and your instruments don't make them any more accurate. Because once you say we know the answer, you stop looking at the question. And that's a real problem, because for him, the deal with the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans was the reason they were so great was because they kept looking for the answer. Even when they thought they had it right, they kept challenging it. Not for the purpose of rehashing, but for the purpose of reifying that the answer is the same, because it's not always the same. So Vico really, has this debate with himself and comes to the conclusion that particularly in the rhetoric of science, the rhetoric that we use to explain our conclusions once we've done dialectics or once we've done reasoning of some kind, he says those things have to be shared. And that's the rhetoric of science. Science draws conclusions. Science shares those conclusions. And anybody who's seen a commercial for any medication knows that there are so many caveats and exceptions and possibilities that might be more true than what the research shows, the empirical research shows. And that's exactly how we're seeing Vico play out here when he says the rhetoric of science cannot be left to just the empirical, that we need to keep asking the question in order to always know the answer. Okay, we then, so we, really, Locke is talking about style and meaning. Bacon's talking about reason. We have Fell, who's talking about reason from a different place. We've got Locke, who's talking about, I just went through Locke. We've got Vico, who's comparing the two, saying that rhetoric is not an art necessarily, but it is a needed skill or a needed art for reasoning. So he's trying to bring those two back together again. Unfortunately, he is completely unsuccessful in his time. He's unsuccessful, because we then have Campbell, who comes up and says okay, let's talk about the philosophy of rhetoric, not rhetoric as philosophy. And all of a sudden, he's giving us all these new terms and definitions, such as moral arguments, that rhetoric belongs to moral arguments, and nobody knows what that means. And of course, what he meant was that in our public discourse, where we decide things, excuse me, based on argument, not based on necessarily pure reason or empiricism, that is moral reasoning. So whenever you see us debating in the public sphere, we're debating the level of the moral, and therefore that's where rhetoric belongs. It only belongs in sort of mediating the public discourse. Okay, so we've really got him focused on, again, that style, that art. Again, we've got Blair, who is 100% about style and delivery. He's 100% in the realm of the artistic or the aesthetic. His lectures on rhetoric and on the belles lettres, he's called the father of the belletristic movement. What does belletristic mean? It literally, the belles lettres literally means beautiful letters. And yes, I guess in a way, I mean those beautiful cursive letters that we see in some of the scripts that we've gotten from monks, or that we've gotten during the Renaissance period, where, you know, there's a really gorgeous big R that's starting off the first word of a sentence, for example. But he also meant letters as in the practice of speaking and of writing, that they should be beautiful above all else. Think Pride and Prejudice, okay? That kind of era of belletrism. We then get to Whately. And what's great about Whately is that he tries to pull it back into the realm of reason. And the way that he does that is he says, rhetoric in the courtroom is what matters. And Whately contributes to the realm of rhetoric by introducing two concepts that are key to our current court system. That is the burden of proof and presumption. I'm not saying presumption of innocence here. That is a uniquely American thing. Forget that. Just presumption and burden of proof. And Whately says that during a courtroom experience, that the jury is taken by the prosecution and by the defense between guilt and innocence. And during the times that the defense is speaking, or during the times when the prosecution is speaking, you're in a constant balance between presumption of what is true and the burden of proof to overturn that presumption. What is presumption? It's what I presume to be true when I walk into the courtroom. There are things that we can presume to be true. And then there's other things that require a good amount of proof to get beyond reasonable doubt. And so when we adopted the court system that, Whately was writing about, and others that came really out of Lockean sort of Magna Carta writings about the social contract and so on. I don't want to get into that. Sorry, that will not be on the exam, the social contract. In that, we adopted into our system not just presumption and the burden of proof, but presumption of innocence. And you don't have that when you walk into other court systems. I listen to a lot of true crime drama. I'm big into it. I go to bed with it every night. And if the courtroom that they're talking about is in Australia or in Canada or in Great Britain, I have to think about that very differently than an American court, okay? Because that presumption of innocence is very different from just presumption. So that's what he gives us. That's what he contributes to us, are those two concepts. Finally, I have you introduce yourselves to contemporary rhetoric, which is an interesting word because Nietzsche has been dead for a long time. I don't know how he made it into contemporary, and so did I.A. Richards. Because here's the deal. These guys are not postmodern, okay? Despite what people will tell you when it comes to their thoughts on language and rhetoric, they are not postmodern, but they are contemporary in the sense that currently their systems of thought are still utilized and debated. I told you not to read Nietzsche because we wouldn't have the time to cover it. So I'm not going to go into that, obviously, and that will not be on your exam. But who will be on your exam, the last theorist that we need to talk about, is I.A. Richards. I.A. Richards is very important because he leads us into sort of a postmodern era after a little while. Now, he was really writing back in the 20th century and the early 20th century. And he was really interested not in communication at all. He was interested in miscommunication. And what I mean by that was he wanted to know where the meaning of meaning was created, where misunderstandings occurred. And that was really what he was trying to find. And he sort of looked at the communication system that we have and said, what's the most basic unit for that? Well, the basic unit is a symbol, a word, right? And how do we establish meaning in that word? Well, usually there's an object or a referent of some sort to which that word is linked. And usually there is a reference that we all have, a relationship with that word or object that we all have. So he developed what's known as the semantic triangle of meaning. And in the triangle of meaning, I'm holding up a triangle. I don't know why. It's not like you guys don't know what a triangle is, right? Sort of at the top of the triangle of meaning is where the reference lives, the thoughts, the ideas that we have about a word or an object. On the bottom left over here, which you're probably seeing as the right now, it just hit me that I'm going to be backwards. There is a word or a symbol, okay? And words are symbols, so I'm using those words, I'm using them interchangeably there. And then on the other corner, the opposite bottom corner, bottom right, if you will, is the referent or the object, that to which I refer. Now, one would think that clearly where miscommunication happens is somewhere between the references that we all have and the objects or the words, right? But no, that's not where the communication gets messed up. According to I.A. Richards, those relationships are very strong. I know what I mean when I say the word dog. I've got an image of what a dog is, and I know what that means. So there's no question about that there. He says no, where the problem occurs is along that bottom line, the relationship between a word or symbol and its object or its referent. Why? Because it's arbitrary. 100% arbitrary. Now, remember what Locke said about there not being a natural relationship between a word and its object? That's what I.A. Richards is pulling on here, is there's no relationship there except that which we assign. And I've had people say, well, what about, the color orange, a fruit of orange, that's orange, a crayon that's orange. Aren't they? Clearly that's rooted in nature, right? Because an orange is orange. Not really. That's not how that came about. The word for orange, the fruit, and orange, the color, is not exactly the same in every language. That's not how that came about. It's a nice coincidence in English, I guess. But, we think about red, we probably picture a rose, right? But that's not necessarily the case. So that relationship along the bottom line between a symbol and its object or its referent is completely unknown. And in there is where miscommunication happens the most. So I.A. Richards was not so much interested in communication as he was interested in miscommunication and finding that place. And I'm positive that the semantic triangle of meaning is in your book. I can't remember what page it's on. I apologize for that. But you will see that there is a dotted line in that area where Richards says the relationship is not secure here. It's arbitrary, it's abstract. So Those are the things that are going to be on your exam. If you have any questions about any of those, or you want me to expand on any of those, simply pop that into the Dear Professor bulletin board, and I'll create a little lecture on whatever is confusing you. Because we have some time before I put your test up next week. In the meantime, not to confuse you, but in the meantime, I do want you to keep reading and stay on schedule. Which would be that you're going to, I think you're supposed to have read some of Burke. I gave us 2 weeks for this because I know that at this point in the semester, we're always catching up. So I'm glad I gave us 2 weeks for Burke, just so that we could catch up. So if you haven't read any Burke yet, that lecture is coming along this week as well. So I want you to be prepared for that lecture. And next up, I'm going to do a short video, I hope short, on your paper 2 that's due. A lot of you are asking me questions about that. So I'm going to go ahead and create that video here real shortly. I'll talk to you soon.